Thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be back. I'm a little bit surprised to be back because I was last here in November of 2020, which was a weird time to say the least, and showed up an Economist. We were all a little bit depressed. It was 2020, right? I think half of us weren't even here in person, and you brought an Economist in. Like, say, let's just make it a little bit worse, make everyone feel terrible about what's going on. And you wanted me back, so thank you so much. I'm flattered, I am thrilled. I do have some updates for you. 4 years have passed. We have new political dynamics to talk about. We have a lot of forecasts today. So I do want to get into it, but I also want to report back. I gave you a lot of forecasts back in 2020. Now, many of the general forecasts, right, the general outlook, the direction of what we're seeing is still very much intact. I won't say the forecast itself is still the same one I gave you then, because we were really looking out about 3 years. So what I've done here instead is I've put together, this is my report card. This is an accuracy calculation of if I was just here 1 year ago and gave you some forecasts for the upcoming year, here is how good we have done in the near term. Now, I say this, again, not because I'm so proud of that forecast accuracy necessarily, but really I'm very proud of the duration. That middle column on this slide, that represents the number of months that each of these forecasts had been in place before we got the final year-end value. In all cases, this is over a year. So what I'm giving you today, the methodology we're talking about, the methodology that we've been using for more than 75 years here at ITR, it sees through the business cycle. It sees through this short-term volatility, which we have in spades today. Whether we're talking about interest rate policy or political proposals, policies coming forward, there is a lot of noise. If you just open the Wall Street Journal, you open any newspaper, news website, there's going to be frenetic headlines, but we don't have to necessarily latch on to that short-term fear. We can use these long-term leading indicators to really see what's coming. So where we stand here in late 2024, closing in on 2025, unlike last time, I have good news for you. That's uncomfortable for me as an economist. I'm going to be perfectly honest. This is not, pessimism is literally written into my job description. That's line 1 on my resume. So I do want to be very clear. This is not just me giving you a good story, showing the kind of cherry-picked highlights. This really is sustainable rise being signaled for 2025 and beyond. Now, that's not true in every sector. Some sectors lead the economy, some sectors lag behind. We'll talk about those timing differences. But general business cycle improvement, we're not out of the woods quite yet, but by year end, by early next year, we do expect those green shoots to really take hold, to really be felt. There is still uncertainty. We're watching things geopolitically. We're watching election, again, concerns. We don't have strict policy proposals from this incoming administration. Commercial real estate, that's gotten a lot of headlines recently. But overall, it's big things. It's interest rate policy. It's inflation. Where are the fundamentals showing that we go? And more importantly, what are the opportunities to come? So let's just jump right into it. You will have access to the deck, so please take notes, pictures as you want, but more than anything else, I don't want to get caught up on the individual numbers. You can go back and look at those later. I'm really here to tell you the story of what's happening in the economy. And if I start high level, big picture, there's really no bigger picture than gross domestic product. This is a measure of everything we produce in this country in a 1 year period, the goods, the services, all of it wrapped up. And if you're just following the sentiment, if you're just following the headlines, you might be a little bit surprised to see that GDP is as high as it is today. In fact, this is a record high. This is real GDP. So not just higher pricing, right, higher inflation. This is real, actual activity. $23.4 trillion, that is a huge, huge total. And the really good news, again, if I'm putting on my optimist hat, is that this number is only increasing going forward. You can see our forecast, I think they're diamonds or dots off to the right. We expect further growth, at least through 2026, really for the rest of this decade. We'll hold that one for the end of the presentation. But what does change is the pace of this growth. So this year, 2024, we have seen a slower pace, but still positive growth in gross domestic product. Now, I mentioned the election. The biggest question that I've been getting lately is, what does the election change? Does that change your GDP forecast or your industrial production forecast or any one of these big headline series? And our answer consistently at ITR is no. Because we have looked not just at, this chart shows the timing of election cycles. Every year, election year is a gray bar on this line. So one of the biggest conversations that I've been having with my clients who I consult with on a one-on-one basis is they're saying it feels like everyone's just holding back. It feels like people are just waiting, right? They're in that wait and see approach. I just want to wait out the election and see what happens. Then I'll make my investment. Then I'll jump in with both feet. So is that a real consistent trend in election years? We find historically no. GDP doesn't seem to hold back before an election and then rise after. It also doesn't seem to necessarily decline. There are a couple of key cases where you do see an election year and then a decline, but a lot of those, I mean, are things like 2008, right, the Great Recession we call it. That wasn't driven by the political cycle. That was driven by other factors. So I don't think the timing is anything that we should be waiting with bated breath. It's still kind of in that holding pattern. But moreover, we also want to look at, does the political party in power matter? So let's put up just who's the president, who's in the Oval Office. We've also done this analysis at ITR with who controls Congress, right? We've actually divided this up. Say there's a Republican in the White House, there's a Democratic-controlled Senate, a Republican House. We've looked at every possible combination of these political parties, and we just don't find a consistent, statistically significant winner. So to put that another way, the economy does not have a favorite political party. We cannot accept better or worse growth under one party or another, or some system of mixed party control. So as I look at that going forward, I really come back, there's a Warren Buffett quote, he said, red or blue, I can still make green. And I love that mentality because the economy is doing what the economy is doing. Our economy, like I just said, $23.4 trillion. We are a behemoth. That is the aircraft carrier that just can't turn on a dime. It really isn't that we knock the cycle off course. So the result of this election, we will talk about policies, not politics. That isn't where I want to get hung up. And here, to bring it back to our local level, if you look at everything I'm talking about on that broad scale, on that overall US total, you might say, well, that's all well and good, but what affects me here today in this region? You find that Tennessee, this is Tennessee's gross state product in comparison to the US gross domestic product. This is about as tight as a correlation can get. So you are a well-diversified economy. You really do reflect that national trend. We'll show some state differences, some even metro-level differences in the later charts, but I do want to give you that confidence that as I talk about these big picture trends, very likely things that you're feeling on the ground here as well. So let's jump in. Now, when they said there was an economist coming, I am shocked that so many of you turned up. You clearly didn't know that I was coming in with some math. So I've locked the doors. You're stuck here, but hang with me for the next just 5 minutes. We'll get back to the pretty charts, the big picture story, the large takeaways. And more importantly, you're going to have a tool that you can take back to your business. Because everything that I do, how our whole fundamental analysis works at ITR, is we're doing a couple of simple calculations to really see into the data, to not just get lost in your month-to-month trend. That's what I'm showing on the first column, raw monthly data. Now, this could be anything. It could be big picture GDP, maybe sector-level sales, housing starts, or we can take this down to a more granular level. This could be just my sector sales. This could be my business. What are my annual sales, annual revenue? It could be one product line. It could be one geography. However big or small this series is, we're doing the same exact math. And the really good news, this is not high-level calculus. This is very simple. You can, I like to say, take it home this afternoon, give it to the intern. 20 minutes later, they're going to show you your rates of change, and that's going to give you the visibility that you need for your business. So what are we doing here? Very simple math. The first one is taking our raw monthly total and calculating a 3-month moving total, or 3 MMT. All that is a simple sum of the past 3 months of data. So we take out a little month-to-month volatility, we get that rolling quarterly total. From there, I'm comparing my most recent 3-month moving total back to the year-ago level. So I call this a 3/12 rate of change. That's because we're taking 3 months of data over 12, going back 1 year ago. That's critical when we look at growth rates. Because if you just read, again, the financial news, you're probably seeing sequential growth rates. That is, the first quarter of the year compared to the second quarter. Now, maybe the second quarter just always is busier than the first quarter. I live in New Hampshire. If I'm, dealing with a construction company, a pool install company, right? Their summer is their busy season. The winter just isn't. So we don't want that normal seasonality to skew how we're thinking about our own business. By taking this 3/12 rate of change, we're taking the same 3 months of the year, either our busy season compared to our last busy season or slow season compared to last slow season, and it gives us an actual apples-to-apples growth rate comparison. But we can do the same exact thing on an annual basis, take seasonality out of the equation altogether, calculate a 12-month moving total, or here I have it abbreviated 12 MMT. And I feel like so many businesses, probably everyone in this room, if I asked you right now, you could quote your 12-month moving total to me. You know that number, you focus on that number. Unfortunately, though, that's where I feel so many businesses stop and they don't take their analysis just one easy step forward to calculate that 12/12 rate of change. To me, that is the crux of the issue. Take your most recent 12-month moving total, compare it to the year ago level, you'll get that annual growth rate. Because what we really want to see is where are we in the business cycle? Not just is my business expanding or contracting, but at what pace? And that starts to tell us how we are moving through the business cycle, how our industry is moving through, how GDP overall is moving through. Once we can start to make these comparisons, now you know where you fit. So I take a 12/12 rate of change, and by the way, that is the metric you're going to see on my slides more commonly than anything else. I live in a rate of change world. I don't live in the real world for many other reasons. But this is what that 12/12 looks like. We graph it over time, and we always will be somewhere on this colorful line. Whether that number is rising or falling, whether it's positive or negative, it gives us a sense of where we stand today. As I said before, not every sector moves through the business cycle in lockstep. So here's where many of our biggest areas are across that kind of wave. Something like non-residential construction, that actually lags behind the business cycle. We'll talk non-res toward the end of the deck, but that is still expanding at a quite elevated pace, but that pace of growth is slowing. Anytime we're in that kind of golden, yellow, orange color, that means growth is positive. We're above last year's level, but we need to be careful. We don't want to overexpand just because we see things rising, because, well, sometimes that orange does in fact lead into the red. That's a recession. We all know what that feels like. So this is a very stylized view of the business cycle. Here's what it might look like in real life, and here's how we take just one more step to see that crystal ball, as we call it, what's coming around the corner. Say this blue line, my industry data, that is the line I care about. It doesn't matter what it is, either my company, my industry overall, but that's the line I want to know more about. We can see, first of all, that we're in kind of a mild recession phase, right, just below the zero line, but I really do want to know, is this the low? Should I be planning for rise? Or, man, should I be planning for just a double dip and I don't want to catch a falling knife? Here's where we use leading economic indicators to supplement that analysis. So we have about, I think it's 13,000 now. My data team just corrected me. They added a whole bunch, like 500 in just the past month. But this is an example, our ITR leading indicator. That's the green line. And the reason I like this leading indicator is because, first of all, it correlates. The two lines kind of match up, right? They rise together, they fall together. But what I'm really looking for here, what makes a good leading indicator and what you should be looking for when you look for your leading indicators is some amount of lead time. This leading indicator, it trends ahead of my industry data. So what I can do is I can calculate that average gap from peak to peak, from trough to trough, and I just physically shift that line forward. In this case, it's by 10 months. That gives me, first of all, a much better cyclical fit. The peaks align, the troughs align, but now I have a view almost a year out into my future. I can see that that leading indicator is recovering. I can say, all right, let's look at not just one, but a system of leading indicators that will give me the confidence that I need to make investments, to do whatever it is I need to do now to get my people ready, get my capacity up to snuff, and be ready to seize this rising trend that's coming for me. So that's what we're doing here today. Thank you for sticking with the math. You are all free now to move about the cabin, but we're going to get into the good stuff. And this is where I get really excited, is where the rubber meets the road, when we put this business cycle analysis into place to see what is happening in the world today. And I do want to start with the world. So we'll start even higher level with the overall global economy. Now, there's going to be a heavy correlation here between the global economy and what I've shown you so far on the US economy, and that's for this reason. I think this is one of the more surprising charts I have in my deck, because if I survey a group of people and I say, who is the largest economy today? Half the time, I hear China. That is not true. That's not going to be true anytime soon. The US is the largest economy on a GDP basis. We make up over a quarter of global economic activity. China is the next largest wedge of the pie, but south of 17%, and in fact, their wedge actually shrunk in the most recent year of data. We will be the largest for at least the foreseeable future. We'll talk China more in a moment, but let's turn also to Europe. If we add up, you can see each component wedge here, we broke it out by country, but if we add up that entire continent, that is about another quarter of global activity. So just between North America and Europe, more than half of everything happening in the world today. Despite higher growth rates out of Asia, they just aren't taking share in quite the way many people expect, and many people, I think sentiment really has adopted. So here's where we stand across much of the world. Now, if you stick with ITR, you'll get used to our color coding, but the quick synopsis is, these are the phases of the business cycle that I showed you on that colorful sinusoidal wave earlier. Green is good, red is bad. It's simple as that. So focusing on that first color-coded column, that is our current 12-12 rate of change. You see some green, yes, Brazil. That is a positive number that is still rising. Now, the reason for rise in Brazil is partially that we're coming out of one recession, and, well, you see our forecast for the next 3 year ends. By 2025, Brazil is very likely headed toward another recession. So we'll discount them. It's nice that's the only red block you see on our forecast here. Otherwise, though, there's a lot of orange. Places like Mexico, even India, growth, but at a slowing pace. What we see more of here is blue. That's our recovery phase. So that means that activity in Canada, in the US, industrial activity in Europe, both Eastern and Western Europe, our industrial economy today is actually smaller than it was a year ago. These are negative rates of change. But these numbers aren't so low as they had been at the trough. So we're recovering. Europe is firmly in that recovery position. With the US, it was a much shallower low, so it won't take us quite so long to get back up to zero. Eastern Europe as well. By year end, I think they'll be back on the right side of things, back up in the green. For Western Europe, it will take us into 2025. But you'll notice that 2025 year, other than Brazil, a lot of green across the board. That is when synchronized global growth really does return to our forecast. Things still positive in 2026, just a slower, still positive pace of growth. I don't see a double dip recession happening here. We do have growth built into the outlook. But as I said before, Asia, that is where we see these higher flying numbers. 5% growth, 6% growth. We would be thrilled with that, somewhere like the US or even Europe. But Asia themselves, China especially, this is a much, much slower pace of growth than they've become accustomed to. So here is the United States industrial economy. This is our 12-12 or annual growth rate in light blue. Comparing that to China, and you see the comparative rise here, 5% growth on a 3-12 basis, excuse me, not 12-12. We would be thrilled with that. But for China, this is nothing to write home about. If you look back a couple of decades, they had much higher growth rates. The economic miracle of China, well, it's kind of happened. That story is largely played out. So I worry about China from that perspective, that they just don't have this story behind them anymore. And by the way, I do always cite the data source at the top right-hand corner. These are the official numbers out of China. So for them to be admitting to this 5% growth, well, we could have a different discussion about what that means politically. Again, I'm not a political analyst. I do expect further growth from China, but this is something that we're watching. Now, the other item that we have all been feeling universally, that is inflation. A little bit of good news here is that inflation has come down across much of the world. Not all of the world. I like to include Argentina here. So many people ask me, is this hyperinflation? They see how high inflation was back in 2021 and 2. And I say, we have some case studies. If you really want to see how bad inflation can get, Argentina today over 200%. And that phase B, that means that number is still rising. So I think we can all take a deep breath, Be grateful we're not in Argentina feeling that level of inflation, and feel a little bit better about ourselves, because in the US, 2.6%, Europe and Canada, those are both closer to that central bank kind of magic target rate of about 2% inflation. We're headed in the right direction. This is disinflation. But the problem with inflation is that it is cumulative. So these price increases, even though the rate of inflation is coming down, that's just a slower pace of prices still rising. This is not deflation. Deflation is if prices go down, if the inflation rate turns negative. So our consumer globally is still feeling elevated prices. We're never getting back to where prices were in 2019, as much as we would love to feel that. But it's a little bit more relief because inflation is, again, cooling off. So watching, I'll talk more about politics in a moment, but nationalism is the long-term play. I see that with Trump's election return to the presidency. We're seeing it in places like Europe as well. That's going to have some impacts, again, not on the big things like GDP. That cycle, it's just too big, it's too firmly entrenched in place. But where I really see the risk in a lot of these policies, especially the ones that have been proposed and talked up most frequently, things like tariffs, things like mass deportations. Uh-oh. You know what happens when a phone rings in a conference? That means an economist just got his wings. So thank you. So I see the impact here being more than anything on inflation. Tariffs are meant to be inflationary. That the goal is to raise the price, right, of foreign production to protect what is typically higher cost domestic production. If we do see tariffs on China, right, there's some political intent behind them, right? We really want to punish unfair trade practices. But if there is something more broad like this universal 10% tariff, just 10% on everything coming in from everywhere in the world, there's no way that that isn't inflationary. We saw this back in 2018. So when Trump did his first round of tariffs, we actually have a great case study of just how much various prices rose in relation. It was all positive rise, right? The exact amount varied. So electronics prices rose a little bit more quickly than household goods prices did. But overall, this is inflationary. So as I look at our current inflation rate, and again, I'm hesitant to take anything that is said on the campaign trail as anything more than campaign rhetoric. So we still haven't seen actual policy proposals for how these tariffs will take effect. So I want to be absolutely clear, that is an upside risk to the outlook I'm giving you here. But let's start back with where we've come from, and that is a 9% peak in the CPI. That is a huge number. If you look back over, what does this start in the early 90s? I mean, we haven't seen anything like this in a very, very long time. Now, on top of that, we had enjoyed this period of relatively low inflation. If you look pre-pandemic but post-Great Recession, I mean, our inflation rate on the Consumer Price Index, that barely even popped above 2%, which is, again, the Federal Reserve's target rate for inflation. So our consumer was in this lovely kind of, golden era of we go to the grocery store and the prices are the same on the shelves year after year after year. Then the pandemic hits, the supply chain issues, a lot of liquidity, which I'll talk about next. And that caused this huge spike in inflation. We all collectively got whiplash. I think a lot of our consumers are still reeling from just how suddenly inflation came back and how strongly it did. So when I say that we're in disinflation, again, that means this line is declining but still is positive. We don't very commonly see deflation on the consumer price side. We have a little bit more disinflation to come. The Fed's been watching inflation, right? It got away from them once. We're now starting to see rate cuts because they're confident enough that inflation is moving in the right direction, that we're getting back toward 2%. And we at ITR agree. I think we have a little bit more left in this story. We'll see inflation get close to that 2% level. But at that point, you kind of see the problem on this slide. Our pre-Trump tariff proposal forecast has already been for rising inflation in especially the second half of 2025 and 2026. In fact, by year-end 2026, our base case is for prices to be up 4.1%. That's not the magic 2% number. There are a lot of reasons for this. Partially, we do expect the business cycle just to pick back up. That's more demand pull on prices. But a big part of the reason is liquidity. If we look at things like the velocity of money, the overall money supply, right, how much money is even out there, those are highly correlated with inflation. Those are starting to show fundamental signs. But this one is the slide that keeps me up at night. This is showing US gross Treasury issuance. So I mentioned the pandemic, right? Last time we all got together, we were getting stimulus checks. We were having PPP loans. All of that liquidity being just forced out into the marketplace. And the goal was to keep the wheels turning. We really wanted to keep the economy moving forward. We did that. We're in a relatively good place now. But you see that spike, that Treasury issuance line in 2020, it goes almost vertical. That was very directly responsible for that 9% peak in the CPI that I just showed you. Keep in mind, though, that 9% peak came in 2022. This doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes some amount of time, some pass-through, to really affect price levels. So the problem, as I'm sure you all can see, and I see some sweat breaking out on foreheads, you're absolutely right to be worried, because for gross Treasury issuance today to be higher than it was at that pandemic era peak, I mean, we're not still getting stimulus checks, right? We're not still in global lockdown, at least no one's told me. This is going to be inflationary. Not today, not tomorrow, but by end of next year, by 2026, these fundamental forces will flow through the economy even before we get things like tariffs. So to take a step back, as we look at pricing pressures today, we can break it down in a number of different ways. Here are some fundamental drivers, but we can also look at just where is the inflation centered in the world today. I divide this chart up into kind of top and bottom. The top half or so of the chart, that shows commodities, that shows raw material inputs. And you see some negative numbers here. Aluminum, a little bit of an outlier. Aluminum and copper have been picking up in pricing with all of this electric vehicle demand, electrification, so some pocket, right, of price rise. But otherwise, the goods side of the world, prices are very, very well controlled. It's the service side where we see continued and very persistent inflation. It's labor. We have a tight labor market. As much as it's been loosening directionally, we'll talk about that next, we have a historically tight position for people versus jobs. So that's causing wages to rise at a higher pace. Even electric power, that's one that I'm starting to get a little bit more worried about as we build more data centers. AI is just hugely energy intensive. We have a real run up in demand for our electric grid, and that's even before things like electric vehicles. Electric vehicles, by the way, what a great opportunity, what a great place to be in, but to think that we have made that technology work, to think that we are there, that we've solved the problem, right? There's no further knock-on effect. I have some clients who work in energy, like power generation. They make these large but still portable, essentially diesel generators. Their biggest customer right now is electric vehicle charging stations, because they don't have enough grid capacity. So in the back of that Tesla charging station, there is a giant diesel generator. I find it amusing that we have come full circle. You don't put the gas in the car anymore. You put the gas in the generator makes the electricity, and that goes into the car. It is, by the way, this is terrible, but it's one step better than me personally. I have a plug-in hybrid. I love my plug-in hybrid. It's amazing. I have solar panels on my house, so I'm being a do-gooder environmentalist. Well, I live in southern New Hampshire. We have a lot of cloudy days. I don't always make enough electricity to cover my needs. When I don't, my power is generated, no joke. A few towns north of me, there is a coal-fired power plant. So I'm one of the few people in the world that proudly drives a coal-fired vehicle. Electric vehicles, we're not there yet. But regardless, a lot of these trends, especially electrical costs, this is going to be inflationary. If you need to lock in costs today, if you can do that, I really only expect upward pressure. But a lot of these general trends are going to be inflationary. So at the end of the day, what does that matter? Well, first of all, it matters to our margin. I see continued margin squeeze for a lot of businesses, especially those that are more reliant on labor cost inputs rather than raw material cost inputs. You're going to have to justify those price increases, know what your competitive advantages are, know how you are justifying that you need more price from your customers. But beyond that, this all comes back to the Fed. We are watching interest rates very closely. If I said earlier that one of the big, just wait and see kind of motivations is to wait out the election, the other one is to wait out these interest rate decreases. The Fed started cutting in September. They came out in force. They came out with a big 50 basis point cut. They did another 25, in their most recent meeting. They've signaled we'll probably get 25 more in the December meeting. They'll probably continue cutting into 2025. The market loves that, right? Lower cost of borrowing. A lot of businesses are excited about this. I know all of my millennial friends are excited to, when can I get my ultra low mortgage rate and finally buy a house? We'll talk about why that is delusional in just a moment. Sorry, any millennials, please. This is why I have no friends. Anyway, but for the Fed to continue cutting rates, they have a dual mandate. Now, I told you we're talking about labor next. I promise we'll get there very shortly. But the other side of their dual mandate is price stability. So if we do see this return of inflation, which I hope I've laid out the fundamental factors to you for, that's going to limit how many cuts they can make. It's really going to limit how deep into 2025 they'll be able to keep cutting. So whereas the market, they were expecting a full 200 basis points over the course of the cycle. It doesn't really matter if they do something in December or if they wait another meeting. What matters is how many cuts in total do we get. And I think that's going to be limited more than many market participants expect today. So we have a free YouTube show called Fed Watch. It comes out every Friday from our chief economist. Overall, though, I'm being a little bit more conservative on how many cuts, how low interest rates can get. I would encourage you to just keep an eye on the Fed with regards to inflation. So I have teased this so much. Let's get into people, because people really do matter to an economy. I know I am an economist. I don't understand people. I have no idea why they do what they do. Everyone asks me about, oh, what societal shift is this? And I say, I don't know. I don't know what's cool and what's trendy. That's why I'm an economist. It's very intentional. But I know that people matter to an economy. First of all, consumers matter. 2/3 of GDP is driven by consumer spending. So I really want to know just where are there more people? If we're talking about regional opportunity, the first necessary step for growth is population. We do have positive population growth in this country today. I will be clear, this is only positive because of international immigration, legal international immigration. We do not have the birth and death rate necessary to hit replacement rate in this country. I might have told you this last time. Actually, we do in 2 states. Currently, the only 2 states with more births than the replacement rate are Utah, first of all, for some hilarious reasons, and the other one is North Dakota for I don't even know why. Did someone say it's cold up there? Love it. Thank you. I want you doing all of my correlations. But regardless, this is total population growth, births, deaths, immigration, movement between states, and you see some real losers here. California is the big one right now. Affordability, cost of living is so out of control in California that people are actually leaving the state. We see a little bit of negativity. It's been longer-term negativity in places like West Virginia, shorter-term in the Gulf, Louisiana, and Mississippi. Chicago, the city of Chicago is almost entirely responsible for the negative growth in the state of Illinois. But what's more fun is let's look at the opportunities here, right? Let's look at the higher growth numbers, these dark green states, and blowing it out of the water, #1 place right now is Idaho, I guess. So I actually do have a reason for this one. For Idaho to grow, it's almost 10% growth. That means that last year there were 10 people in the state of Idaho. Today there are 11, blowing it out of the water. No, so Idaho, someone told me that everyone watched Yellowstone, which I guess just came back and just wants to buy a ranch. That's why like Montana and Idaho are just really seeing population flows. That's not what's driving the picture here. By that same logic, let's look at someone with a large denominator, right, where it is harder to move the needle. Right now, that is places like Texas and Florida. Those are some of the darker green states. The entire Sun Belt, right, the southeastern US, right across, and some opportunities still up the Mountain West. That's where we have for a long time seen these shifts. Those are trendy areas, especially younger people want to be there. So that's where I see the natural growth kind of conditions taking hold. Because again, this is not just our consumer base, which 2/3 of GDP, that's nothing to sneeze at. This is also our labor force. And increasingly, we just can't do every job remotely. There's a lot of callback. So I pulled the numbers for Tennessee, actually quite healthy on a state level, 4.1%. Nashville is a hair below that, still healthy, still above the US average. Knoxville, seems like, I don't know what's going on in Knoxville, if anyone from, no one's, that's fine, we'll skip them then. But this is, again, where we are finding that relief both on a consumer basis and on a labor basis. So as I look to the labor market, I mentioned that things are loosening up a bit. The Fed, in all of their commentary, they blamed the labor market. They said, we see the cracks forming. We don't want to see further deterioration. That's why we're going to start cutting interest rates. That's stimulative, right? That boosts activity, that boosts the labor market. If I look at the overall numbers, though, we are coming from just an insanely tight position in the labor market, and we still are tight compared to any long-term norm. So the chart that I'm showing you, I know you all expected to see an unemployment rate. That's typically how we talk about labor. That's not what worries me as an economist today. Sounds inhuman, but you know I'm part robot by now, so we've gotten that out of the way. I don't care about those workers that can't find jobs. There are so few of them today, and that's just not what's holding the economy back. What I care about today is this chart. This is the jobs that can't find people. So at the worst, at the tightest point in 2021-22, we had 2 job postings for every 1 unemployed worker. We don't have the people necessary to fill all of these open positions. That is a hindrance to business. Now, today we have seen this line lift off a little bit. Today we have about 88% of an unemployed worker per job opening. It still is not a 1-to-1 ratio. So as much as the Fed is talking about this directional pullback, please keep it in context. Yes, things are loosening slightly, but this is nowhere near long-term historical averages. And even more critically, while we're seeing some relief here in 2024, right, you see that line ticking up, I don't think this trend lasts for long. By 25, with demand coming back, that is going to cause a lot of new job availability, right, new jobs to be posted, companies looking to hire. And we just don't have the people who are going to be ready to step up and fill those jobs. So here it's just a numbers game. This is where mass deportations do worry me. It won't be in every sector, but in things like construction, undocumented workers make up the most recent estimate I saw. It's, again, everything's a little fuzzy in the illegal world, but it was about 13% of construction workers are currently undocumented. Where we have more job openings in construction than we have almost ever had, that's going to be a constraint on new building. That's going to really limit how these projects can flow through if we don't have those folks or if they're scared, right, to go to work to get a job. So immigration, legal immigration, even if we could multiply it by 6 and still not have enough workers to fill all of these unfilled openings. So maybe that's a potential easing, but I don't see that happening in the current political climate. Where else can we get more workers? At the end of the day, we could go back in our handy time machine and we could have more babies about 20 years ago. That's a great way to have more workers today. Unless anyone has a time machine, that really isn't going to work because this new generation who's just now graduating school, starting to get their first jobs, Gen Z, they're actually a smaller generation even than the millennials, my dreaded generation had been. So they're certainly not sufficient in scale to replace all of these retiring baby boomers. So where else can we find workers? Well, the other thing we can do is just find people who aren't currently working or aren't even looking for jobs, folks who are not part of the labor force, we call it. So labor force participation rates, that's what I'm showing you on this slide. Clearly some opportunity, right? We see a pretty low historical participation rate in the 16 to 24-year-olds. But again, most of them are still in school. I don't think we've materially shifted enough to the trades that you don't need a 4-year college. We're seeing some movement that way, but that's not going to be the floodgates opening of people going into the trades. So let's look at prime age workforce. That is the top 3 lines on this chart, the 25 to 54-year-olds. Now, many of these folks during the pandemic, they actually left the labor force altogether. You see that tick down. Someone got furloughed, got laid off, and they said, you know, my kid's home doing remote schoolwork. I'm just going to stay home, or they just got disenfranchised for some other reason. What's interesting to note today is that we've more than made up for that difference. So folks who left the labor market during the pandemic, they have more than come back. In fact, prime age labor force participation today, this is at a more than 20-year high. So what that means is we have fewer folks sitting on the sidelines saying, I'm not actively seeking work, right? I'm not sending in the resume and going on job interviews. But if the right job fell into my lap, I would certainly take it. We pulled them all back in during this frenzy of hiring in 2021 and 2 when you saw the now hiring signs just everywhere you drove down the street. You saw sign-on bonuses, this hourly pay, those benefits. We've brought them back in already. What more could we do to get these last few people who are still sitting on the sidelines? So that's why I don't see the labor market really loosening up further from here. If you have been struggling to hire and thought things were getting easier this year, please don't take your foot off the gas pedal. This is a great year to lock in labor costs, to find probably some pretty good people. It's not the same in every sector, right? The tech sector, we hear about layoffs. Other sectors, though, like construction, man, that is tight. And to hire specific skilled individuals, I'm hearing from my manufacturing clients, it is just impossible today to find a CNC machine operator. So there are pockets, this is not completely symmetrical, but what is a general trend is how tight things stand. So what can we do to get more people, if not into the labor market in total, just to my company? Well, we're going to compete in a more aggressive way. We're going to offer higher wages. We can do the benefits, right? We can do the culture. We can do the ping pong table in the break room, whatever it is. But at the end of the day, the easiest way to compete is just through dollars. So here is a map of wage inflation by state. Now, again, I fell back into this doom and gloom. I know I'm an economist. Again, we are built to be pessimism, and I hear it in my voice. If you go to a job interview at ITR, and you come in, they shake your hand, they say, how's it going? If you say, oh, it's going great, nope, wrong. That is not the right answer. You're already out, you've already failed. The correct answer, by the way, is relative to what? So that one took a second. So I hear it, but let's force a little bit of silver lining from this slide. If I were to have been here 6 months ago or a year ago, this whole map would have been much darker purple. So again, wage inflation, it is coming down. It's not going backward. We're not seeing deflation. We won't see deflation. We don't give wage cuts, right? When you get a raise, you very rarely give that raise back. So watch, again, the added margin compression that we're seeing from just the cost of hiring more people. Now, last night at dinner, we had a great discussion about AI. I will admit, I don't know everything there is to know about AI, but I don't think many of us do yet either. There are certainly experts in the field, but as I follow the long-term things like productivity trends, labor force productivity, that's what we need to see. We need to see AI, automation, pay off in some way, because if I'm paying more to my human workers, well, I need to get more out of them somehow. So if we can have efficiency gains from this technology, great. We preserve our margin, right? That's the goal here. Unfortunately, as I look at, and again, not company specific, there are companies that are absolutely winning at this, but there are also a lot of companies whose AI strategy, I call it the throw money at it strategy. There's no intent. There's no, I need to solve this specific problem this specific way. Here's who can do it. And so overall, labor force productivity, it's been flat for a very long time. It's not yet seeing these gains from AI investment. In fact, on the manufacturing side, which is where I would argue we have the lowest hanging fruit, right? Repetitive tasks that you can use, right? Like co-working robots I've heard about. I feel like manufacturing is really where this should pick up first. Labor force productivity is actually going backward. So the winners are the ones that are going to harness this in again, an intentional way, not just to throw money out at it, and are going to use this margin to expand offerings, be more efficient. I still think today, I've told you that I don't think interest rates are going back down to the ultra low levels they were. I think some firms are waiting for that before if you have to borrow money, right, to make a big investment. But I really believe that today this investment is still worth it if you can get that efficiency, if you can do more with fewer people. That's the name of the game going forward. But this got depressing again. Let's force it back to some more good news. And that's the other side of this labor coin. I've talked about how tough it is for businesses, how tight the labor market is, how we're paying more. But at the other side of that coin, these same employees, this is also our consumer base. Again, consumers make up 2/3 of GDP. So for consumers, almost everyone who wants a job, maybe ex-tech sector, but in manufacturing and construction, you can typically find a job. More people being employed, more people making more money. At the end of the day, this is good for our consumer base, and that is the foundation that our economy rests on. So as I look at this chart, real gross domestic product, right, we've talked a lot about that, $23.4 trillion, but I'm comparing it on this slide to real personal income. And critically, what that little word real means, it means inflation adjusted. Because even though we're earning more, well, if I have to go to the grocery store and everything costs 20% more, I don't feel better. I'm not actually better off. This chart makes that adjustment. It says that our wages have actually outpaced consumer price inflation. We are actually better off today than we have ever been at any point in history. Our purchasing power is higher. Our ability to go out and spend that money, it is higher, even if our sentiment just isn't keeping up. Sentiment does lag. We don't feel great when we see eggs being, what, $6, $7 a dozen, at least up where I am. That's the base. So a lot of pricing is stressing us out. We love to complain about it. But the numbers themselves, they show this disconnect from the sentiment side of things. By the way, on the data calendar, we get new sentiment data next Tuesday. I'm going to be watching this closely because eventually that lagging sentiment, I have to believe, it will catch back up to the real point where we stand today. But there's also a big discrepancy happening within this consumer base. So I'm showing you some total numbers, right? This is every consumer, everyone in the country here. We do see some pockets of concern. And critically, the income stratification, that has mattered more this cycle than in many others. The upper income earners, they have really been outperforming. And this type of business cycle, that's not surprising. They've been much more insulated. So if I look at something like overall growth in retail spending, for upper income earners, households earning more than $100,000 per year, I believe it was 16% and change growth versus lower income households earning under $60,000. Their spending is still up, but it's only up mid to upper single digits. I could get the exact numbers for you. But we do see this stratification. We see some pockets of concern popping up. We see some folks kind of, I say, slipping back into their old habits. So if we look at consumer debt, our overall debt measures, those are still very healthy. Total household debt as a share of our median earnings, it is over 100% of earnings. That doesn't worry me. It's typically over 100%. We're not so stressed as we were back in 2006. But if you look at credit card debt, here's the headline, by the way, that I hate the most. Every time we get a new month of data, I see this headline pop up, and I get it. It's doom and gloom. It's Chicken Little. The sky is falling. It's going to sell newspapers. But this headline says, credit card debt today is at a record high. Well, big surprise. Credit card debt, the dollar value total, that's almost always at a record high. Because first of all, inflation is positive. So if I buy the same basket of goods, well, it costs more today. That's more money on my credit card. But we also have positive population growth. More credit card accounts, it makes sense that there would be more credit card debt. In fact, if you divide it, credit card debt per capita, that's actually going down. But that doesn't make for a very good headline. That's not going to sell any newspapers, so you don't see it. So instead, let's take an honest view. Let's scale this information. Credit card debt as a share of our earnings, yes, that is on the rise, but 14.6%, I mean, we're coming off of an insane low because all of our consumers, they got those stimulus checks very smartly. Many of them paid down that high APR credit card debt first. That's why you see that light blue line just plummet back when we got our stimulus. So today, yeah, we're slipping back into old habits, but 14.6%, it's about as good as things got during the last normal cycle pre-pandemic. And what really matters at the end of the day, it's not how much debt we have, it's can we service that debt. And today, across auto loans, mortgages, credit cards, all of our debt, we do have that ability with these rising real incomes. So at the end of the day, I see our retail spending only increasing from here. The level of retail spending, dollar value spending, $8.4 trillion in the past 12 months. That's the bottom set of lines on this slide. And it corresponds to the growth rates on the top. 3/12, our quarterly growth rate is in gray. 12/12 annual growth rate is in teal. So you see a slower pace of growth, yes. But in a lot of ways, this is just normalizing from that pandemic kind of boost, right, that we got. That was not normal. We weren't intending to keep getting stimulus payments like that. So our consumer, yes, some signs of stress in certain segments. Upper income certainly performing better if you have that ability to target. I think that will be beneficial in the near term. But overall, I'm not worried. I'm not worried in the case like we were in 2006, certainly. There's a lot of stability here. It's a tightness in the labor market, those rising real wages. That is going to continue this trend going forward. And in fact, that really relates well to this next section, housing and construction. I promised you we'd get here. I know there's a lot of interest in this segment. But single unit housing starts, what a great gauge of our consumer. How good they're doing, how stable they are. Now, you will notice a contraction recently. Back in the past couple of years, that 12/12 growth rate goes pretty severely negative. The way this chart is scaled, it doesn't look like such a dive on the absolute level of starts. But hovering right now, bottom set of lines, 12-month moving total, just over 1 million units started annually. this is a healthy level of new home construction. At the end of the day, we have a supply shortage. We have very low inventories in housing. There's a lot more demand, and I further see a ton of demand sitting on the sidelines. I mentioned my millennial friends. Yes, I have a couple of them. But a lot of them want to be home buyers. They don't own a home quite yet. And so they're waiting on the sidelines. They're saying, hey, Lauren, my economist friend, when is the housing market going to crash so that I can afford to buy my house? And I tell them, well, you're the problem. You know that, right? Because if there are millions of you out there waiting for a market to crash, let's talk supply, let's talk demand, let's find where those two lines cross. Nothing can, the bottom can't fall out from this market if you are the backstop before the bottom falls out. So affordability is the strain here. That home price has risen so much, it's a little bit out of reach, especially with these higher mortgage rates. Affordability is really what caused this recession that we're now coming out of. We're now on the outright growth side of. But back during 2021 and 2, when mortgage rates rose so aggressively, that's when we saw, some people call it golden handcuffs or the mortgage lock. If I own my home now with my, 2 and change, 3% mortgage rate, maybe I bought then, maybe I refinanced, I'm sitting on an appreciating asset that has a very, very low mortgage rate. Why would I sell that and buy at a 6 or 7% mortgage? That is a huge hit to the monthly payment that I'll be making. So many existing home sales just shut down. Now we're starting to see, again, mortgage rates improving somewhat, not back to where they had been, but moving in the right direction. And we're also just seeing a lot of folks who need to move. So one of my coworkers, he's also out here speaking. You might see him on the road sometime, Mike. His wife is pregnant right now with their 6th child. He bought a house at a high mortgage rate at the peak of the market because with 6 kids, he needed to. So a lot of folks are now just biting the bullet. We do see an uptick in existing home sales. I know the looks of horror, that's how I feel. But at the end of the day, whenever existing home sales decline, that really disincentivizes new home construction. This affordability picture is why we saw that decline. And furthermore, now that we're seeing the bounce back, we're seeing a little bit of loosening in this market, don't expect growth, expansion in new home construction to just light the world on fire because affordability isn't totally gone from the market. I'll talk more about that in just a moment, but I wanted to show the regional, this is, by the way, not housing starts. This is a leading indicator for starts. This is permits. Makes sense logically. You have to pull the permit before you can break ground and start the building. But here in Tennessee, it seems like there was a little bit of a pop, and now we're coming back down to some more normal long-term levels of construction. With the amount of demographic inflows that you're getting, that population growth, I think this is justified and then some. So I do have a negative rate of change signature here, but I would expect long-term we need to see more growth, especially in growing markets like this. But affordability is not completely gone from our calculus. We see slight benefit. If I showed you existing home sale prices, those are still on the rise, but new home sale prices, those have been, I don't want to say declining, but tempering. We're not going back down to those pre-pandemic 2019 levels, certainly. That just isn't the way things will be flowing. But we might have overshot the peak, especially in certain markets. I know Wyoming looks very, very negative on this chart. It's just because they rose so much that a very, very slight decline being the only negative number on here, just the way the program pulls colors. It's really not that bad. The rest of the country, though, again, especially where I am in New England, we have a real inventory shortage, so very strong appreciation in prices. And I mentioned more so than even that cost of the home, right, that dollar value price, it is mortgage rates that matter to our monthly payment. At the end of the day, yeah, I'm looking at the house cost, I'm looking at the number of bedrooms, the curb appeal. At the end of the day, what I want to know, especially as a first-time home buyer, is can I afford that monthly payment? Now, mortgage rates, this is the long-term, the 30-year conventional fixed rate. That did decline slightly, even in advance of the Fed starting to cut rates. It doesn't move in perfect lockstep, but look where we are today. Fed funds rate, it's come down 75 basis points. Again, maybe we'll get a few more. I don't think we're getting a full 200 like the market had been pricing in. Starting to see market sentiment turn in that direction, which is encouraging. But let's say we go even another 100 basis points. What would that put us? 5.4% at the kind of best case scenario? Say we get to 5%. This isn't the 2s, 3s, 4% rate that many people are looking for. So what I tell all my friends is if you're looking for that ultra low rate, if you want to lock it in, again, you're going to need that time machine. But let's keep this in the context of our rising wages. Our consumer is doing relatively better. Affordability is at least not still getting worse. We are getting relatively better. It's not a linear trend. So the light blue line on this slide, that shows the income gap, the gap between what we should be earning and what we're actually earning. It's kind of making not a linear recovery, but this weird W-shaped recovery. But it is generally moving up. And here as well, this is my absolute favorite slide. It is not improving in every market. There are some real strains, especially on the coast, when it comes to affordability. So what this map is showing, this is the difference, the average deficit between what people in each state are actually making, excuse me, not individuals, households, between what a household is making in that state and what they should be making to afford the average mortgage on the average home at today's interest rates. So for California, I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses, but it's about $120,000 short of what they should be earning. That is huge. That is a tough market. That's honestly why California is losing population. Now, there are two states that are actually positive right now, West Virginia and Louisiana. Actually, oh no, a couple more popped positive in the past month of data. This is what falling interest rates do. That's good news. So we do have a couple of green states here. Moreover, we also have a few that are kind of that light green, pink color. Even if we're within $5,000, $10,000, even $15,000 of balance, that means that mortgage, it's not so far out of reach, right? I can budget in other areas. Maybe I'm not in that perfectly budgeted, a third of my income goes to my housing costs or whatever magic number it should be. But I can make that choice, right, to make that, that reach, right, with my budget. So this is going to affect trends regionally. This is going to be a big driver, not just in places like California, but we will see it more prevalently across this coming growth cycle. So if you're here for the non-residential construction, I hope you are still with us for the residential piece, because it turns out that residential new home construction, it's actually a fantastic leading indicator to non-res construction. First, we get the people in the homes, then we build everything else around them, the schools, the hospitals, the malls. So we find that on average, the light blue line, housing starts, that's the one we just looked at on a national level. But the dark blue line, non-residential construction, it follows behind the residential construction market by 2 years. You have a ton of visibility into what's coming next for your construction segment because of this relationship. And I'll show you a few more leading indicators that, again, I really hope you take back with you. So non-residential construction, this has been really blowing us out of the water, really outperforming relative to other places in the cycle. 7.7% growth, that is healthy. Most folks in the non-res world, they don't feel this coming pullback yet, but be aware, this is already a slowing growth trend. I expect the rest of this year further slowing, further decline in growth rates. It's going to be next year, 2025, that we see that outright negativity, very mild contraction, growth not coming back to this market till 2026. Now, we could talk interest rates for part of the reason. There's a much longer lag between interest rate policy and non-res construction compared to things like residential construction, right? We budget for a product, maybe we have to issue a bond. We do all of that financing much sooner, much earlier. So today, many of these projects that are still being even started or completed, they went into planning process in a very different environment. So we'll see that lagged effect into 2025 with things like interest rates, also things like occupancy rates, things like overall real estate pricing. All of these leading indicators are showing just a bit more downside. The occupancy trend, by the way, that light blue line here, very clearly showing that low to come with a more than year of lead time. Now, occupancy rates, I'm showing this as kind of all sectors occupancy. Obviously, there is a lot of differentiation if we look into things like, say, office construction, much more vacancy than is historically normal in the office space. Even in industrial building, that's been ticking up very slightly recently. But places like retail spaces, apartments, high rents, low vacancies, some of these sectors will be a little bit more supported going forward. So I hope this is visible to you. Again, you'll get the slides after if you can't read this from the back of the room. But what this is showing, top two lines are single unit and multi-unit residential construction. The rest of this page is non-res. So if I just focus on that first color-coded column, where we stand today with regards to our 12-12 rate of change, everything is in decline, whether that number is positive and declining or negative and still falling. Recession in the case of office construction, slight recession in mall construction, multi-tenant retail we call it, and a little bit of contraction in warehouse construction. Now, warehouses, that I really want to caveat with the fact that warehouse construction just was surging so high. This is a little bit of like a reciprocal dip. There will be a lot more growth on the other end. Warehouse is really one of my favorite categories for non-res construction because we have seen so much re-onshoring, so much near-sourcing. We need these warehouses today as nodes in our supply chain with the new kind of US supply chain flow. We also just need them as consumers. I want my free 2-day shipping, so we need more distribution centers around our country. Warehouse construction is a long-term great opportunity. Otherwise, though, the rest of these, from education, hospital, private manufacturing construction, water and sewer, these are slowing growth rates and further slowing expected by year end. It's going to be a little bit more negative across 2025 with the exception, as I said, of the warehouse space and also of water and sewer. I do see a higher floor for those. But then look to the final column, 2026. That is the year of growth. That is the year that all of this construction comes back, that we feel today's benefit from these lower and declining interest rates. It's just a little bit more lagged of a cycle. So I want to be sure we leave time for questions, but let's wrap up with a broad view of the US economy. Again, I've talked a lot about various sectors. We've talked about GDP and the ongoing rise in gross domestic product, but let's take that apart a little bit, deconstruct it. What really has been supporting that growth in gross domestic product, it's not the manufacturing economy, it's not the industrial economy. Recently, it has been the service sector. So you see that light blue line, service, personal consumption expenditures, that is supporting most of this growth. Not consistent across the board. My parent company in accounting, probably not quite so happy this year as others, but from legal services to real estate management, scientific consulting, there is a lot of opportunity across the board, and this rise really just picking back up in 2025. Now, I know there's a high medical concentration, so I did also want to show you a few of these long-term winners. Medical is a big one of them. This chart shows the comparison GDP, which we've talked so much about, is the dark blue line compared to hospital services revenue. And man, this line is just on the rise, really only increasing in opportunity as we get this aging population. So we broke down some of, excuse me, some of those fundamental drivers, right? Who's funding it? This is a rising trend across the board, especially as, again, baby boomers age onto the Medicare rolls. That's going to have a higher contribution from consistent sources like government spending here. So as we turn to something like the industrial economy, I mentioned this is technically in recovery, but only so technically. If you look at that growth rate down 0.2%, this is about as mild as a negative case can get. If you look at the absolute level of production, so bottom set of lines here, that is where we really don't even see contraction. Yes, we are a hair below last year's level, but I'm calling this plateau. We have largely seen the size of our industrial economy flat since really last summer, so for more than a year now, just holding here, just treading water. Again, the sum total, and we do expect growth in 2025 and beyond, but the sum total of flatness is really obscuring a lot of the underworkings, right, the differences from sector to sector. So this is a kind of quick summary of just who's winning, who's on the upside. Construction machinery still benefiting from that currently high non-res construction, from rebounds in residential expected soon. Others, though, chemical is down, beverage production down. Finish out the alphabet here. We are still seeing more negativity, but mild. It's very, very flat this cycle. This has not been that the bottom fell out from under us. And again, going forward, last time I was here, we were talking about supply chain issues and just a fundamental reworking of the global supply chain. The good news I have for you today is I did not bring that message back with me. We track things, leading indicators like the Purchasing Managers Index, that is the light blue line on this slide, and it shows normalization. Inventories are finally normalizing. Our economy is getting back, maybe it's a new normal, I hate that term, but I think it is somewhat appropriate here. We're getting back to finding our footing, and for the rest of this decade, there is really good growth ahead. I could end my presentation there, and I think everyone would be a little bit happier, but I did say for the rest of this decade. So what you all, I know, have just been thinking about, worrying about since last time I spoke to you. And if you didn't see me back in 2020 when we were all just so bummed out, here's where I lose every friend that I have made in this room. The 2030s. We at ITR, we are still calling for that depression event to come right around 2030. So the rest of this decade, make hay while the sun shines. It is going to be a great opportunity. We will have so much growth to seize, take advantage of. But toward the end of this decade, don't let that optimism run away with you. Because we are, and we have been for more than a decade now, probably closer to 15 or 20 years, we have been forecasting 2030 is a demographic pinch point. 2030 is when our aging population, we just can't really eke it out. We can't kick the can down the road any further. Because demographics, number one on our depression driver list, it really is influencing much of the rest of this list as well. Higher healthcare costs, because as we age, we consume so much more healthcare. I read a study, I forget the number of days, but they said, what's like the break-even point where you consume as many healthcare cost resources in the end of life? It's something like the last 2 or 3 months of life compared to everything in the entire rest of your life up to that point. It's very, very expensive to get old. It's really expensive to die. So higher healthcare costs, a lot of that rolling onto our government budget in terms of Medicare, Medicaid, higher entitlement spending, Social Security, right? We all know that is a problem. I've talked about why inflation is relatively higher for the rest of this decade already, so I don't want to belabor that point. But all of these things flowing into higher and higher national debt. So just to address healthcare costs first, even before you add this aging population in, we here in the United States, we spend so much more on healthcare per capita than even our, I've got to call the Home Office. There aren't that many economists out there. I'm getting worried about Brian and Alan. But as we look at, and I'm not just talking about the Indias, the Chinas, the Mexicos, but look at our peer nations, places like the UK, Canada, Japan. We're spending 2 or even 3 times more today per capita than they are. So as this rolls onto the government books, I mean, spending, we know spending is already out of control. We haven't had a balanced budget since the 90s. But what's shocking to me today is just how out of balance that budget has become. So top line, transfer payments. So that's entitlement spending. That's anything that's transferred directly to an individual. So as I look at transfer payments, yes, that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It's also, and where you see that big spike, that was the stimulus payments. We had a huge surge back in the pandemic. Good news, transfer payments did come back down, but if you look at that trajectory, we didn't go back to our previous level. We didn't even go back to the previous trajectory, if you put a best fit line here. We just made a new baseline, and it's only rising from this point. Go down 2 lines, that orange one, second one from the bottom, consumption expenditures. That is the discretionary stuff. The stuff that no one goes to Washington to say, I just want to cut discretionary spending across the board. So that's on the rise as well. We're, first of all, nowhere near covering our bills by that lovely blue line, current tax receipts. If we do get policies to reduce taxes, which President-elect Trump has put forward, that's really not good for that blue line. That's not good for our ability to pay our bills. Now, I've heard a couple of arguments for, first of all, how unserious these things are. So maybe we'll get some rate decreases in terms of tax rates. There was even one interview that President Trump did. He made a statement somewhere that he would eliminate the federal income tax. And so it sounded a little off the cuff, so he's in an interview later and they said, hey, were you serious about that? Are you actually going to eliminate the federal income tax? And the exact quote, I kid you not, I have had to memorize this. He said, yeah, sure, why not? So do we take that seriously? I have this problem as an economist, and so we did out the math. That's $2.4 trillion. That's half of current government revenues annually. How could we fill that gap? The argument that has been made, not by Trump directly, but by other folks who kind of are behind this to eliminate the federal income tax, they say, well, fill the gap with tariffs, right? Go back to the 1800s. That's more how things flowed then. Well, we're a very different economy than we were back then. We're not on the gold standard for one, but if you look at the amount of foreign goods that we bring in, Currently, $3.2 trillion worth of goods. Now, if we put a huge tariff on, that would probably decline, but just for argument's sake, say that held steady. To fill the void of eliminating the federal income tax, that would take a 75% universal tariff. That's not something even Trump is proposing. So there's going to be some gap there. Now, again, I'm not taking him at his word that that's really going to be a policy proposal to completely eliminate the income tax. We might see it eliminated on things like, I know tips and overtime was the one that actually does sound a little bit more serious. I have to say from an economic perspective, right, I can run the numbers, I can say what would the hit be to the deficit, what would that mean for our budget. From a human perspective, oh my goodness, if people respond to incentives. So if I know my tips are tax-free and the rest of my income isn't, you can guarantee businesses are going to try to reduce that wage component that is taxed and increase what the tip side of things might be. And from my human perspective, if I have to have one more white screen turn around at me and ask me for a tip on somewhere that I've never had to tip before, I just might scream. But that is not an economic perspective. That is just me personally. But regardless, there are current issues with this deficit. It all does roll into more and more debt. And really where I see the concern happening on this slide, it's that little green line at the bottom, interest payments on the debt. That line is rising very rapidly, partially as we take on more and more debt. Here's what our debt picture looks like. We, in late 2023, hit the magic $100,000 of federal debt per capita mark. But also as interest rates are higher. I've told you before, we're not seeing rates go back down to those lovely, let me go back a slide, those near zero levels that kept these interest payments relatively low for a very long time. So interest on the national debt, not the principal payments, just the interest. First of all, it's more than doubled in the past couple of years, but today, this is higher than our entire Department of Defense budget. This is a huge cost. It's really running away from us. So all of these things together, I see the spiral happening. At some point in our demographics, we're going to hit that wall where baby boomers, that big generation, we just don't have balance anymore. And again, 2030 is where we expect that to happen. So here's the real question. How can I stand up here with a big goofy smile on my face and say, hey, a depression's coming in 2030, I've got a plane to catch, see y'all later. I really do believe in this as an opportunity, and I sound a bit delusional about that. But if you know it's coming, you can protect yourself on the way down. I don't think any of us individually, honestly, even our political leadership at this point, if they believed this and if they wanted to stop it, it would be a hard freight train, runaway train to catch at this point. So we can't do anything about it, but we can prepare ourselves, we can prepare our families, our businesses, for what is to come. So that's why I do see some opportunity. If you're relatively well positioned, a lot of people are going to make a lot of money in the 2030s. The first necessary step is to protect yourself on the way down. So number one, switch to wealth preservation. Maybe not 2030. We will see the leading indicators as it gets closer. I wish today I could tell you it's going to be October 5th. It's going to be 3 p.m., sell everything, go hide in a hole. But we don't know with full granularity exactly when it strikes, but we'll have leading indicators as we get closer. So be ready. Don't pull the trigger yet. There's a lot of upside you'll miss if you switch to wealth preservation today, but know what your plan is. Be ready to pull the lever when the time comes. I think some of the best things we can do to prepare some of the best relatively safe assets, it's going to be, first of all, don't be over-levered. Don't buy a jumbo mortgage right before this. Don't be completely equity heavy at that point. I think some of the traditional flight to safety assets probably won't be the go-tos. So by that I mean the US government treasuries. Typically, we perform very well in times of economic stress. But if our treasury bonds, well, they are the problem as we can't pay them back, that's not really where we should be invested. But I think some of the greatest assets will be other relatively fiscally healthy government debt. Places like Canada and Australia are top of my list. Switzerland as well. If you need a fourth, I don't dislike Sweden. It's going to take time, right? So if you need help figuring out how you do investments in those foreign securities, we have people in place who can help you, or even just have a call with your advisor and they'll give some strategies. Please reach out to us if we can help with that. But again, it's those relatively healthier governments. Canada, very, very fiscally responsible. If you look back to 2008, when our banking system is just in free fall, their banking system barely blinked. They're very conservative, very traditional. So protect yourself on the way down. Maybe hard assets, right? Real estate probably will take a hit, but not as big as others. At least you have a place to live, is what I like to say. There will be some safe assets. I think those are a few of the best ones. And then, oh my goodness, at the low, buy up everything you possibly can. Protect yourself on the way down. And what do they say? Buy low, sell high. This is Econ 101, Investing 101. So this is going to be a multi-year event. I want to prepare you for that. It's not like 2008. We all say the Great Recession. That was what, 2 quarters, maybe 3 if you count it wide. This is going to be years, maybe 4 or 5 or even 6 years of decline. It is going to be so emotionally hard to buy at that low, to see it through the doom and gloom and the sky actually falling. But if you can switch back to an aggressive position at that low point, man, this is the greatest wealth generating event that any of us will ever see. So withstand the inflation of the rest of the decade. Don't just put all of your money under the mattress where it gets eaten away, but have this plan in place and really enjoy the rest of this decade before the sky comes crashing down. Have a good umbrella, and I think we'll all get through this okay. So I do want to be sure to take questions. I know we have about 15 minutes left, but just a quick summary before we get to the sky falling of where we're going from here. This is opportunity. It just doesn't look exactly like opportunity always has. There's going to be more inflation. That's going to be new to a lot of our consumers. So if you need a good, better, best model, if you need to help them, right, see the value in products, that will be a little bit different. Overall, again, USA-centric is the wording on this slide. We are seeing so many foreign direct investment flows. So many people want to be here. That is an opportunity. Look for new clients, new customers that you haven't seen historically, because we are seeing new opportunity pop up just with this investment, with this re-onshoring. This is a great, great place to be, and it will be for the rest of this decade. Then all heck breaks loose. I do have a QR code up here. If you want to keep up with us, we have a lot of YouTube videos. Like I mentioned FedWatch. We also have one called Trends Talk. My show is By the Numbers, that we just cut through headline noise. That's what I think you can tell through my presentation. That is where I really get excited. But a lot of blogs and free resources here. If you do have any questions, we really love to help companies. That's what gets me out of bed when I wake up every morning, is to just make the world of business stronger. I know that's why you're all here in this room. So if we can help you with that at all, please reach out to me or anyone on my team. We would absolutely love to hear from you. But we have some time left, so I would love to turn to any questions. There are a couple of microphones going around. What can we answer? There's one right there. Perfect.
Thank you. I do appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
And the consistency.
Uh-oh.
If you've been predicting it for 10 or 15 years into the 2030s.
Everyone asked if I would come in and say no 2030s today, so I'm sorry to disappoint those of you who are looking for that.
But my question is, we talked a lot about inflation, and I'm curious your view as a private economist. Most of the economists are employed by the U.S. government, et cetera. So
Yikes,
I'm curious your view of some of the trueness of the inflation data. Like inflation calculations have changed over the decades, and if you price things in different, do you trust the government view, or do you do any adjustment within your own head?
Oh, I love the just nerdiness of this question to start us off. Thank you so much for that, because this is the world I play in. It's true. So I showed you a lot of CPI data, Consumer Price Index. That gets a lot of, I think, very valid criticism, because the CPI, it is only urban areas, so it doesn't even touch much of the country. There are some categories that it doesn't hit. It's not the broadest measure of inflation. It's not the best measure of inflation. I would say it is consistent over time. So sure, maybe we're not at exactly 2.6%, right? That's going to be up a little, down a little, but it's at least consistent to its own history. So we can see inflation, disinflation, deflation. I hope none of you even remember the exact number I quoted, except that it was headed toward 2%, right? The story is what matters to me in the terms of the business cycle. Now, the reason we tend to use CPI instead of PCE, which is arguably a better inflation gauge, personal consumption expenditures, that's the one the Fed uses, by the way. Their kind of core PCE is their target inflation metric. The reason we use it, I firmly believe, is just because it comes out first in the month. So we get another week before we have to have the PCE data. So PCE, it's a little bit broader. It's typically close enough to CPI for argument's sake. That does include a broader swath of consumers. It includes things like payments made on behalf of a consumer. So if I'm not paying my own healthcare, right, my insurance is paying that, that would be included in PCE, but not CPI. Again, I could go all day on the technical side. I'll spare you that. But what I'm really watching for, and why I think our common consumer sentiment is really diverging from these trends, is that everyone has their own CPI number, right? Your inflation is different from my inflation. So if I own a house that I've seen appreciate versus if I rent and I've just seen my rent go up and up, that's a very different thing. If I buy more, like right now, we say average grocery prices since late 2020, they're up about 20%. That's huge. But bread prices are up a ton, and fruits and vegetables are up like 5%. So if I eat more fruits and vegetables and less bread and packaged goods, my inflation is going to be lower than someone who eats differently. So we all have our own inflation measure. That's why I like it enough to use it. I like it enough to track where it's headed and have a forecast for it. But you're right, no one's exact individual CPI is that number. It's just a gauge for us. Thanks for the question. I know there's another mic going around. Did it find a question? This one over here. All right, over here first?
Yep.
Great.
Hey, over here.
Awesome.
I had a question around, there's been a lot of conversation in the last few weeks in particular around the Federal Reserve potentially purchasing Bitcoin or cryptocurrency.
Yes.
Which gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Yes.
But I know that there may be some bills introduced in the coming months when the new Congress is seated to either sell some gold and purchase Bitcoin.
Yeah.
What does that tell you? What does that look like for just everyday consumers, everyday citizens?
Sure.
Or do we even have any idea of what that could mean for the economy as a whole?
That's, it's so interesting because this new administration, it seems like it matters who your friends are, and if your friends are very, crypto bros, right, does that skew anything? I find it fascinating. I'm not personally big. I made myself go out and buy like $10 worth of Bitcoin just so I would have to pay attention to it. And I'm going to be honest, I don't know how to log back in, so that didn't work for me at all. I think any of these cryptocurrencies, it's such a new thing. It's still, the landscape isn't totally settled. So I'm not saying put all your retirement money in Bitcoin, please, 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 anyone in this room. I think it's interesting. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, but there's also so much volatility in an unsettled landscape. I mean, the reason we all talk about it and hear about it so much is that someone said, oh, I made so much money. Well, anytime there's high reward, that's because there is high risk. Those two go hand in hand. So what I'm actually much more interested in, it's the blockchain. I think the technology that these currencies are built on have incredible applications for banking, for supply chain. That's where I actually get excited. But as for the, if the Fed buys Bitcoin, maybe I don't think it would be done in such scale to matter. It's not going to delay the 2030s, for example. But the other thing we very likely could see is like a Fed coin, a US government kind of digital currency coin. China has done this. I'm waiting for the US to do it because I don't think they want to cede that trade advantage entirely to China. Again, I'm not the expert here, but that's one that we're watching. I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen, and especially under this administration where there are people who probably would lead that charge. That's what I'd be watching for. I'm probably not going to be participating in any of those markets anytime soon, but if you know more about it, if you're interested, I don't think it's an absolute bad thing. Thanks. And there was one over here, but do we have the microphone? No? Yes? Awesome.
I'm wondering if there's like something in your indicators that's like a filter or a screen that you put over it that accounts for like potential for exponential, like I think of like Moore's Law where it's like computing power doubles every year since 1965. Is there something, I was wondering when you mentioned about the work, it's going to be near impossible to find workers for construction.
Right.
Is there some kind of overlay that you might put over that to say, well, that whole industry might change? May or may not be AI,
Sure.
but I just wonder statistically.
Yeah, we look at the relationships, certainly. So I think with construction, it worries me that that is where our constraint is. You know, again, if you said manufacturing, I'd say, okay, how can we automate more systems that are currently done by hand and take a few people out? But construction, I mean, we can't automate away a plumber or a carpenter, right? Those trade jobs, that really does need a human. Maybe the human can get more efficient, right? Maybe the engineering could have some kind of benefit on the other end, or even like site surveying, though, that's so physically, you know, individual required to do it. A human needs to do that work. So for construction, I think that's why I pick on that industry most. It's where we do still see rise in job openings versus manufacturing, right, has tempered a little bit. Other things like professional services, right, a little bit cooler right now than it has been. Construction, we just don't have the people, and we're seeing a lot of movement, especially as we get increased kind of labor tensions, right? If the dock workers get a great deal, well, hey, I've been running a crane on a construction site, I can go run a crane on a port. That's the same, you know, it's transferable skill sets, and more than anything, we see the transfer out right now. Eventually, again, supply, demand, I do believe that the capitalist system works to balance resources, but I just worry about that sector more than others, that there might be some friction before we get that full resolving. Thank you. I think we have time for just one or two more questions.
Hi, good morning.
Okay.
I was actually 2 days ago listening to an economist who has very similar forecasts as you, but says that bottom is going to come in 2026.
Ooh, really?
So I was just curious. I like your prediction a lot better.
Okay.
I was just curious
Glad to help.
if there's any variables in your trending that maybe says it could happen earlier.
So he's saying a big bottom, like a depression kind of bottom?
It's
really?
like it will be bottomed out in December of 26.
Oh gosh. I hope not, but so I'm going to be honest. I do think we have more time, we have more juice left in the system. And I know I've come back to this time and time again, but for me it is the consumer. Our consumer is our base. They have a lot of stability. If we saw the type of subprime debt of just too much debt altogether like we saw in 2006, that's when maybe I'd be a little bit more worried that we just couldn't support ourselves, keep the bottom up from under us. But moreover, our population, again, it does, to me, come back to demographics. We do have an aging system, population, excuse me. We do have more baby boomers, but you all know they're hanging in. They're not crashing and burning by 2026. So I see this as just a little bit more time to kind of enjoy the next cycle. From a cyclical point of view, if I looked back at that industrial production chart, you notice we've had a couple of dips. It's actually very rare to have 3 hard landings in a row like we've had. Now, a few of them, one was a commodity price collapse, one was the pandemic, which obviously skews some incentives. So I will say for 2026, and I can't remember, no, it was an EO Phoenix group that I said this to. I hate to even say it because that's right, it's all coming back. I spoke to them, I think it was 2019, and one of the questions was, well, what could make this either come sooner or come later? What could avoid the 2030 depression altogether? And at that time, I kid you not, I said, I don't know, maybe if we rebalance our population, like a global pandemic that disproportionately affects elderly people, like that could help. And that was in 2019. And the emails that I got that were like, your crystal ball, like I need it. Oh my goodness, I've never felt so bad about a just offhand comment that turned out to be weirdly prescient. So I spoke to them again a couple years later. We laughed about it. It was great. And someone said, you know, what could cause this to come sooner or later? And I said, I don't know, some crazy, unforeseen, non-economic event, right? The black swan event, something coming out from left field, like an alien invasion. And they all go, don't say that. So I am not saying alien invasion, but it would be something coming from left field. We'll be watching for it, but until then, thank you all. It has been so much fun. I'm going to turn it back over to the panel now, but I really appreciate y'all having me back. Thanks.